So many cultures have their stories about how winter came to be. The ancient Greek people would tell the story of Persephone and Demeter. And Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest and the earth. One day she was out picking flowers, and she was kidnapped by Hades, the god of the underworld, which is where people went after they died. When Demeter found out that Persephone was missing, she mourned so strongly that she neglected her job in taking care of the earth, and everything withered and died, and it was winter. Finally, the winter was so long that Zeus interceded and made a bargain with Hades that Persephone could return, but there was a condition. Since Persephone had eaten 3 pomegranate seeds while in Hades, she would return for 3 months of the year, and thus we have a winter season every year. This is the story of Jesus now, as told by Eric Walker Wickstrom. There once was a little boy born to parents from an oppressed people in a tiny backwater village from which no one thought any good could come. Not much is known about his early years, except he was sharp of mind and large of heart, and increased in wisdom and stature, and likely in favor with God and man, quote unquote. It seems likely that he took seriously the religion of his people, so seriously that it set him apart from his earliest days. As a young man, he began to preach and to teach and to heal. He taught that all people are God's children and that it doesn't matter who you are or what you do. God loves you anyway and will embrace you with joy if only you'll turn toward the love. It is said that this boy, known in his day as Yeshua, was so filled with this love that when he spoke, it was as if God were speaking, and when you looked on him, it was as if you were looking at God face to face. Crowds began to gather around him, crowds mostly of the poor, of the outcast, those whom others deemed unworthy. A community grew, a community with a welcome more wide and deep than people had seen before. Even some of the scholars and the priests and the well-to-do found a home with the itinerant band that followed this wandering preacher and healer. Quote, "Whenever the crowds learned where he was, they followed him, and he welcomed them and spoke to them of the kingdom of God and cured those who had need of healing." End quote. He taught that God's kingdom was not some far-off dream to be yearned for, but something real within each of us, that it was something to be worked for. He taught that each of us, with faith, could move mountains, and that if you bring forth what is within you will save you. He taught that the love of God and the love of neighbor are inextricably intertwined, and that pious words alone are not worth teaching, are worth nothing. None of these teachings were well received by the authorities, of course. Neither the religious authorities nor the authorities of the state who heard his description of the kingdom of God thought it was a good one. They heard in his description a decidedly negative comparison with the kingdom of Caesar. Such radical egalitarianism was a threat to the status quo, and the growing crowds became worrisome too. And so Jesus was arrested, tried, and sentenced to die. On Friday evening, he was taken out, humiliated, beaten, brought outside the city walls to be nailed to a cross. And the crowds who had so recently invoked hymns now hurled invectives. His closest companions abandoned him in hidden fear. I have to have the rainbow while I'm reading this. Even in the face of all this, he refused to return evil for evil, offering only love as he had all his life, praying to God from the cross for forgiveness on behalf of those who did these things. In time, he died. His disciples moved his body from the cross and placed it in a stone tomb. But as the Sabbath was beginning, they could not properly prepare the body for burial. A stone was rolled in front of the entrance, and this man whom many had seen the light of God in was gone. The light of the world, as they called him, was snuffed out, and those who knew him were bereft. Thus ends the story. It's often said among ministers, at least, that in our faith we jump over Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday and get on too fast with Easter. We avoid talking about death and go straight to resurrection. I think it's a pretty fair assessment because, after all, I have never done a Good Friday service in 15 years of ministry, and I have never once had a member of the congregation ask me to. But it's worthwhile to spend some time in the darkness before breaking into the light. I've often talked about this time as a time that it's a fertile time, a time of gestation before the births of spring. But it's important to realize that winter, too, is a death. Yes, we will get to spring and to resurrection, but that makes the death no less sorrowful, no less meaningful. And of course, a lot of winters, those that represent real and final deaths, these don't end. We lose people, never to have them reborn again in our lives. This week, in Holy Week, I got some tough news that represented something of a death in my own life. And I'm not going to go into details here because that's not important, but it made me grieve, and I'm grieving still on Easter morning. It's important that we mark our losses. And so we remember Persephone going down into the underworld, and Inanna going down into the underworld, and Balder and the Norse myths being killed by Loki's arrow, and Jesus dying on the cross. We remember winter, our losses, the grief that each of us will bear in time, and these we hold in our hearts as we await spring and Easter morning. Our K-5 class studied Passover last Sunday, so I'm not going to tell the full Passover service this Sunday. But today is part of the week of Passover, although it's not one of the days on which a Seder is usually celebrated. So this is a contemporary story by Alyssa Davy Permain, based on the Jewish tradition of the Passover Seder. I told it a couple of years ago, but it's one of my favorite Passover stories, so I'm telling it again. It's titled Grandmother's Lesson. Before telling the story, she set out a goblet for Elijah and it's saying to me, before telling the story, we should open the meeting house door. And I'm going to ask, what children do we still have present? Bella, would you like to go open the front door of the church for me? So one of the customary actions during a Passover Seder is to set aside a chair and a cup for Elijah and to open the door so that if Elijah the prophet should show, he can come in and be welcome. All right, thank you. Come on back in. I don't know if we can keep it open, so we'll have to do symbolically. Thank you. So here's our story. Once upon a time, there lived a brother and sister named Leah and Sam who were about your age. They were Jewish, and Passover was their favorite holiday because there was so much to do. The day before the Seder, they would help sweep the house and clean out all the breadcrumbs, help set up the table with the special Passover dishes, and put aside an extra chair and a cup for Elijah the prophet. Then on the evening of Passover, the relatives would arrive, and the Seder would begin just after sunset. One year, they came to a place near the end of the Seder where their father poured the wine into Elijah the prophet's goblet and asked the children to go and open the door for him. This was one of their favorite parts because it was so mysterious. They ran to the door and looked up and down the street. They didn't see anyone except the new children next door. They had just moved from Haiti, and they were playing in their yard. No Elijah. Leah came back to the table feeling sad. "Where is Elijah?" she asked. "Every year we pour him wine and we open the door, but he never comes. What does he look like? Will he ever come for Passover?" Her parents looked at grandmother. "I have seen him," she said, though I didn't realize it at first. Elijah comes in many disguises. "I saw him long ago when I was about your age. One cold day just before Passover, I was minding my younger brothers and sisters, and my mother was resting. There was a knock at the door. I opened the door, and there stood a beggar. He was dressed in rags and had an old sack over his back. I saw that his shoes were full of holes. 'May I come in and sit by your fire and have some food?' he asked. 'I am so hungry and cold.' I knew we were not a wealthy family. My parents worked hard and still had barely enough for a simple meal, let alone a Passover feast. 'We have nothing extra for you,' I said, and I shut the door. I peeked out the window and saw the beggar walk to our next-door neighbor's house. The neighbors had even less than we did since the father had died. The mother worked very hard taking and sewing, but she had many mouths to feed. I was sure that she would turn the beggar away, but I saw her open the door and invite him in. The next day, my mother was cooking our Passover meal, and I was setting the table. Suddenly, there came a cry from the kitchen. Our dog had grabbed the chicken from the counter, knocking over the apple raisin pudding my mother was preparing. And when my father got home, he found us sitting and crying. There was no money to buy another chicken or to make dessert to celebrate our Passover. We were sitting and crying when we heard a knock on the door. It was our poor neighbor. She smiled at us and said, "It seems that misfortune has come to you. I would like to invite you to celebrate Passover at our home this evening. I don't have much, but as you know, I somehow was able to make more matzo balls than usual from my flour, and my soup kettle is full." My parents thanked her and promised to bring the foods they had prepared that had not been spoiled. After our neighbor had gone, my mother asked me, "Who was that knocking at our door while I was resting yesterday?" I said, "It was a beggar. I told him we didn't have enough and sent him away." "Where did he go?" she asked. "To the neighbors," I shrugged. My parents looked at each other. "Do you know who that beggar was?" my father asked. "No." "That was the prophet Elijah," said my mother. "He came to see if we are helping to make the world a better place by being welcoming and generous." We had a wonderful Passover with our neighbors. We found that when we shared from our kitchen, there was plenty for all. When it came to the part in the Seder where my father poured wine into the Elijah cup, I asked if I could go and open the door for Elijah. My parents smiled. Grandmother finished the story by saying, "I didn't see Elijah again, but ever since then I try to treat everyone as if they were Elijah, and I find that there is always enough." When grandmother's story was finished, everyone was quiet. Then Sam asked, "What do you mean that you treat everyone like Elijah, grandmother?" Grandmother looked at them and asked the question, what was the last kind and welcoming thing that you did for someone? "I helped my teacher to carry some books because she was tired," Sam answered. "I invited the new girl at school to play with me and my friends at recess," said Leah. "How did it feel?" asked grandmother. "Good, warm and happy," they replied. "This is how it feels to treat everyone like Elijah," grandmother said. Then Leah jumped up from the table. "I think Elijah would like us to invite our neighbors to celebrate Passover with us. Can we invite them to our Seder?" Mother and father looked at each other and smiled. The new neighbors weren't Jewish. They had recently moved to the neighborhood from Haiti, but this was exactly the spirit of welcoming that Elijah taught. Yes, go and tell them that if they would like to join our Seder meal, they will find the door open. It seemed that Elijah did visit that Passover day after all. Our words for silent meditation or prayer are by Victoria E. Safford, titled Desert Spring. They had no idea where they were going when they left that night in the dark, without lights, without shoes, without bread, their children smothered against them so they would make no noise. They had no idea what they were getting into, following this Moses, this wild-eyed one who claimed visions and made promises, but who, after all, could guarantee them nothing except death if they were caught. They had no idea, these slaves, what it could mean, this promise of land, their own country, and life abundant. Of freedom, they knew nothing except what they could taste by living in its opposite, slavery, and that taste became a hunger. And that hunger became insatiable till they were ravenous for freedom. And they went out then, but no one knows to this day whether they were led by Moses or by the outstretched arm and mighty hand of something else, of something eternal, as they would afterwards and always claim, or whether their own human hungry will made them flee that night from Pharaoh. They went into the wilderness. There they wandered 40 years, which in those days was a lifetime. 40 was a good old age, and so many of them died before getting anywhere. And many were born in the desert and grew to adulthood, knowing nothing but the journey, not slavery, not freedom, just the going. They whined and complained and muttered in some mutant need, for they were a stiff-necked and rebellious people. You can read it for yourself. Ungrateful people, even when manna rained down from heaven and quails were sent to feed them. Unhappy people, longing out loud even for the familiar security of Egypt, of all places, where at least they knew what to expect, as awful as it was. Impatient people, making cheap little idols and gods of metal to bargain with in secret when the traveling got hard or merely dull and the days and years became monotonous. In the springtime, we remember the promised land is not a destination. It is a way of going. The land beyond the Jordan, that country of freedom and dignity and laughter, you carry it inside you all the while. It is planted in your mind and heart already, before you ever start out, before it ever occurs to you that in order to leave that life in Egypt, the intolerable bondage of that life, what you need to do is stand up and walk forward. The story of Jesus is told again by Eric Walker Wickstrom. On the third day, the women of Jesus' community went to the tomb to wash and care for the body. To their astonishment, they found the stone rolled away and the tomb empty. Beside themselves, they asked everyone they met, "Where have they taken him?" A man they supposed to be a gardener said, "The one you are looking for is not here." But that was hardly helpful. And yet, finding no answer from others, they found one in themselves. Jesus' death on the cross was not the end of the love-filled life they had known. Jesus of Nazareth, Yeshua ben Miriam, was still alive, and they ran to tell others. The companions, still frightened and despondent, were locked together in an upper room. They would not believe the women's story. They would not believe that all was not lost. Yet even though the doors were locked, and perhaps their hearts as well, the spirit of their teacher came, assuring them that death is not the end of life. And this is what we celebrate today, that life is stronger than death, and love is stronger than anything. The story of spring, The Crocus by Lynn Unger. Living in the violence of spring, living in a time where shells are cracking and shapes alter, who can afford to risk forgetting the danger, forgetting the moment the crocus bulb breaks ground, never knowing whether snow or sun or ice awaits in warm or jagged welcome? There are no choices here, no careful path or reasoned way, no holding in reserve for some more settled, some more propitious time, but only the unconsidered faith of the crocus, whose saffron petals echo or demand the sun. So in the poem Manifesto, the Mad Farmer Liberation Front, the poet Wendell Berry writes, "So, friends, every day do something that won't compute. Love the world, love the Lord, work for nothing, take all that you have and be poor, love someone who does not deserve it, denounce the government and embrace the flag. Hope to live in that free republic for which it stands. Give your approval to all you cannot understand. Praise ignorance, for what man has not encountered, he has not destroyed. Ask the questions that have no answers. Invest in the millennium. Plant sequoias. Say that your main crop is the forest that you did not plant and that you will not live to harvest." And then at the end of the poem, he says, "As soon as the generals and the politicos can predict the motions of your mind, lose it. Leave it as a sign to mark the false trail, the way you didn't go. Be like the fox who makes more tracks than necessary, some in the wrong direction. Practice resurrection." I liked this concept of practicing resurrection. I recently read an article by an Anglican priest, Giles Fraser, in which he said, "The resurrection is the name we give to the multiple ways we push back against the darkness." He says, "Do I believe in resurrection? Of course I do, and I believe in it by frying bacon and refusing to give up. This Easter rising is not just some fancy intellectual idea, it's a form of praxis, or practice. It's something you do, resurrection." Carl Gregg, a UU minister in Maryland, echoes these words in an article titled "Practice Resurrection." He says, "We should worry less what people say they believe happened 2,000 years ago, and more whether we are living as if resurrection still happens. The question," he says, is how are we partnering with God today in transforming despair into hope, apathy into compassion, hate into love, and death into new life? I really like this idea that resurrection isn't a noun, it's a verb. It's something we are doing by practicing it. This kind of resurrection I can believe in, making more tracks than necessary, like the fox, loving the world and frying bacon and refusing to give up. Resistance and resilience, that is the resurrection we need right now. This is the resurrection of our society into the beloved community. This is Easter morning.